Good evening. My name is Eric Kirk. I am with David Frank. This is Redwood Wonk. Although I'm not in the Redwoods, I'm from a hotel airing from a hotel in Livermore. Before we get started, I just wanted to briefly just say I'm saddened by the death of Mark Shield. Of all the talking heads, was one of my favorites. Shields and Gergen on PBS. He was actually one of my inspirations for doing this type of thing. Dave, you want to say anything quickly about him? Are you familiar with him?
Yeah, I actually remember him from back in the days of Shields and Jagot. So he was always a voice of reason and the clarity with which that he spoke. You didn't have to agree with him, but you understood that he understood. And I think that it was a really he was an important contributor to a better understanding of the political dynamics that in across the country, and so he will be greatly missed, I'm sure, by many people.
Well, he's certainly, any voice of reason is missed in this crazy time we're in. And speaking of crazy times, the January 6th committee is moving on, and actually Donald Trump, who is obviously the primary focus of the January 6th hearings, has expressed frustration at Congressman McCarthy, the minority leader, for having failed to get any of the Republicans onto the committee, because the committee that has taken turns that have not gone. It's led to a narrative that apparently has not gone the Republican way. Originally, he wanted to get Jordan on. I forget who the other guy was that were actually kind of implicated by a lot of these hearings, and the Pelosi said, no, you're not putting those guys on. They're probably going to be subject matter in this thing, and so McCarthy said, well, we're not going to dignify your circus with allowing anybody on it. And of course, Kinzinger and Cheney came on anyway of their own accord. But now Trump is upset because none of the Republicans came on other than those two. And well, without their input or ability to block anything, we've been able to have very informative hearings, and they are getting more informative daily. And in fact, they've come into new evidence. They were going to complete the hearings this month, but now they've been extended into July as of today. And so I think it gets more and more interesting. So interesting that the Proud Boys attorneys asked for their trial to be put off from August to December because they're afraid that their their juries would be impacted by the findings and by the information that's coming out from this. And the judge agreed with them, and so their trial's been put off till December. That's saying something, and Trump is in a panic. What has come out? I mean, it's hard to even know where to begin. I mean, there's just been so much that has hit the news, we could get into the mother and her daughter, who were election workers, with their tearful testimony, the election workers in Georgia who face death threats, who can't even go shopping without being harassed, to Raffensperger, I'm probably saying his name right, coming out and just saying this is absolutely ridiculous. Republican himself, coming and saying this, to Judge Michael Ludwig, who Eastman actually clerked for, conservative to the core, retired judge, has not always has actually bucked the party line before. He actually rejected President Bush's call to have Padilla and other people designated enemy combatants, in claims of terror and the rest. So he's been independent before, but solidly conservative. I mean, all to the core. And even when the American Spectator, conservative magazine, tried to challenge him, what he was saying in terms of his conclusions that that Trump was trying to get the crowd worked up by saying the Proud Boys were already infiltrating the perimeter of the Capitol while he was still speaking, blah, blah, blah. And even Rachel Maddow doesn't go along with Trump having called for the violence, blah, blah, blah. They can't attack him because he has no political ambitions. He just came back to basically say the Republic is in danger. I mean, that's a big deal. Dave, what are your talking points?
Well, thanks, Eric. It's good to speak with you again this week. I thought a great way to frame this for this week, where we are, was that, like, what was the focus on Tuesday, like yesterday, because so much came out just yesterday, and part of this, the general theme that they tried to show with witnesses and the full presentation was that Trump's inner circle were not trying to persuade their GOP allies across the country or even within their campaign team with evidence, arguments, ideas. Instead, no facts on the ground that were ever, no evidence, nothing. Rather, there was a narrative about power and a campaign of coercion and bullying. And it was crystal clear eventually to these people that testified in front of the committee. And again, these are all Republicans, whether they're the secretaries of state, whether they're the lawyers that worked for Trump on the campaign, all the way, across the spectrum of the people that were participating yesterday. It was an inside game here. They wanted to make clear that it appears to me that they wanted to make clear what exactly happened, who knew what and when. And the presentation showed three main Trump campaign lawyers that they knew, they advised Trump and Giuliani and the rest, Eastman and the inner core team. They advised them that the plan to have alternate electors was illegal and that they refused to participate eventually. That was their opinion. And there was a Meadows staffer there who testified, and she said she was present when they gave their findings to Meadows and Giuliani, and that so she heard it. She was a corroborating witness, even though it's not a criminal court. But the election staffers, they basically, so one of them said, look, I felt like a useful idiot when I finally told them I'm not participating in their scheme. And so that's generally what I saw, and I'll throw it back to you for a minute, but before I go down into the specific states, but I think it's important to hear, like, when Adam Schiff was asked, what were you trying to do? Why did you limit it to the limited evidence that you did present? He said, we proved today that it was a premeditated criminal plot with President Trump involved in the planning, even though he knew it was illegal, and that he influenced and agitated all the actors involved, and then he sat back and watched the violence unfold despite being in a position to stop it. Like, that was their goal for yesterday. So I think it was, that's according to, an insider. And then he said, now the Department of Justice can decide if there's sufficient evidence for any specific crime. This is not a criminal court. I'm not a lawyer, but that was my takeaway, generally speaking, of what happened most recently at the committee hearing.
Well, the hearings tomorrow are going to focus on Trump's attempt to basically corrupt the Department of Justice, to basically politicize it, involve Stop the Steal, where basically Barr had quit. He was hoping that Rosen would become his, do what he wanted to do, and Rosen will be testifying tomorrow, and that should be some very interesting testimony. And it's amazing, actually, how many people from Trump's circle are willing to testify. They're not just providing statements and depositions; they're willing to testify. I mean, it's kind of interesting how this is all developing. This is how actually Watergate started to break. People started to talk. Now, is this going to result in Trump going to jail? I am really skeptical about that. And I don't think Trump is going to be president in 2024. I know people said that. Everybody said he wasn't going to be in 2016, but I don't think he even wants to be president, quite frankly. I think he's just running a scam. I think he's raising money off of this. I don't think he wants to be president again, quite frankly. But that's I think he wants to be the kingmaker. But basically he's infected politics. He knows he's losing his grip, and that's what's making him angry. He's losing his grip on the party, despite the fact that he's got so many people in the party and so many candidates that are forced to adopt the big lie. And we'll talk about it later in the show. How he's got the Texas GOP having to adopt the big lie as part of its platform. I mean, he's still got a lot of influence on that, but it may cost them big in November. We'll see. So it's this influence, I want to talk a little bit about a conservative paper magazine that started in 2018, known as the Bulwark, and a lot of the dissenting conservatives, quote unquote true conservatives, as some people are calling them, are writing for him, including Will Crystal, who is the son of Irving Kristol, who was a socialist in his younger years and an intellectual. I consider even a greater intellectual in many ways than Buckley. If anybody ever wants to watch Arguing the World, it was like four people who went in different directions. I don't want to get sidetracked, but Bill Kristol has been tweeting. He says, there is a lot of right-wing media, a lot of conservative media counter programming, but no counter evidence. Nobody is countering what is happening here, and in his view, they're losing the narrative, and sooner or later, people are going to be part, by watching this. I mean, it will sift into certain minds. Now, there is a cult mentality around this, and I've been watching this on social media. People aren't citing; they're just mantras repeating fake news, fake news, fake news. Russia hoax, Russia hoax, Russia hoax, but you're not seeing arguments.
So Eric, you've touched on so many things. I feel like I don't think I've ever said this to you before, but I kind of got goosebumps here because you just started peeling back layers of the onion and you got to like the core. We don't usually go that deep or that far, but because you mentioned it, I just want to say it before I pivot back to the actual January 6th hearing, because we don't have a ton of time left on this topic. But you mentioned Bill Kristol. He tweeted the other day, and I'm not a Twitter person, but this hit my radar too. He tweeted, and again, conservative intellectual, like with bona fides, like he's legit. He said, not to sound like AOC or something, but the degree to which the Republican Party has become a party of performative populism layered over unabashed oligarchy is pretty striking. And basically what he's saying is that you've got core wealth at the heart of the party's decision-making apparatus that is playing puppet master to agitators in this writ large, however these agitators play out. And so when you see, just to circle back, like I want to give you credit for mentioning him, mention his quote, because he actually threw out there like, look, I don't want to sound like some lefty or anything, but look how broken my party is. Like that's kind of what he said. And I think this is in response, at least in part, and this is an older quote, so it's not in response to yesterday. It's in response to like the just evidence evolving over the course of these hearings. And so I think it's important to mention that so Georgia testimony, Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger said he was speaking to Giuliani, and Giuliani promised him, I have the evidence, I have the names. And in fact, I have the lists, I have the data, and he said, really, not a single allegation was credible. We investigated them all. When they kept pointing to look at the numbers, he said the numbers just show us that 28,000 Republicans didn't vote for president, but they did vote down ballot. That's what happened here. Like this is what you guys keep pointing to. That's not evidence. That's just a number. That's a count.
Yes.
But what was the response to that? The response to that was for them to send people into the streets, to people's homes, to threaten them with their lives and tell them about how they're going to get lynched and stuff. So there was, this bullying campaign. This is just one example, because I know we have to move on. Something very similar was witnessed in Michigan. Something very similar was witnessed in Arizona. So there's a lot of evidence coming out. And the last thing I'll say about this is that there are attorneys who were out last night saying that, look, a lot of this is on audio tape. So we'll see where this goes.
All right. Well, we do need to move on. I do recommend the Bulwark. I think it is to the right what New Republic is to the left. But we do need to move on. I recommend it.
Excellent.
And the mayor was definitely intoxicated. There were suggestions by, I believe it was Mayor Giuliani, to go and declare victory and say that we won it outright.
It was far too early to be making any calls like that. Ballots were still being counted.
I don't know that I had a firm view as to what he should say in that circumstance. The results were still being counted.
Did you ever share, Mr. Kushner, your view of Mr. Giuliani? Did you ever share your perspective about him with the president?
I guess, yes.
Tell me what you said.
Basically, not the approach I would take if I was you.
We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
All right, as promised, we're talking about the craziest platform I've ever seen, and I've actually read it. I recommend people Google the Texas GOP Platform 2022. It's insane, not just because it adopts the big lie and says that Joe Biden did not win the 2020 election, but it holds out that homosexuality is immoral. I mean, it's just other absolutely crazy things. It says all gun control is a violation of the Second Amendment. All gun control. I mean, we don't even believe that all speech control is a violation of the First Amendment. They don't, because their platform contains speech controls. So it's absolutely insane. And yet they adapted it, and some of the Republicans are even saying it's crazy. Some of the people who were there are walking out of it despondent. And you can bet that Beto was going to be hammering Abbott in the governor's race in this. And what the Republicans there said, hey, if you don't like it, leave the state. Don't move here. Well, no, actually, if you don't like it, we're going to try to get moderates and some of your Republicans to vote against you, and it's going to be used against you. What is the thinking here? Is this Trump just have such a lock on it? Is it that the crazies just have control over the party, or is there some deep strategy here, Dave?
So before I dive in, I'll answer your question directly. A Republican strategist was asked. His name is Matt Mackowick, and he was asked, what was his takeaway generally from this convention, and he said, quote, "The platform reflects the direction that party activists believe the party should take. Rather than deciding elections or dictating legislative actions, the platform is more relevant as a signal of where primary voters are and what they care about." So it was, in a sense, really a reflection of their passions, for lack of a better word. So I found an interesting little summary. Will Weiser from the AP, and then also another summary, Bill Chappelle from NPR. So give them full credit. This is where all this came from. So I think Will it was who listed the previous platform, just for context, showing how the GOP in Texas has an ideological wish list. That's what he called it. In 2010, they opposed critical thinking in schools. In 2014, they declared homosexuality contrary to God and endorsed reparative therapy. In 2020, they said Texas retains the right to secede from the United States should a future president and Congress change our political system from a constitutional republic to another system. So they actually modified some of these in their newest incarnation in this 44-page document that you referenced. Will says they've broken new ground in their push to the far right. So here's just, I know you gave a couple examples. I want to give a couple more, and then I'll throw it back to you. So one of them was President Joe Biden is the acting commander-in-chief who was never legitimately elected. We believe, this is them, of course, not myself. We believe that the 2020 election violated Article 1 and Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. They accuse several secretaries of state of illegal actions, alleging that substantial election fraud in key metropolitan areas distorted the results in Biden's favor. They call for a secession of Texas getting put to the voters in 2023. They're declaring homosexuality now. They've gotten more extreme. It's an abnormal lifestyle choice. They reject the age of purchasing assault rifles get moved. The language on that actually was shocking. They said the reasoning behind this is because this cohort they are those most likely to be victims of violent crime, and therefore they're the ones who most likely need assault rifles to defend themselves. Yes. So they also call for the U.S. leaving the United Nations. So this is really a wish list of reactionary, sort of anti-globalist, anti-liberal. You could name your sort of categorization of what it is, but really it's the passions at play here.
But if Beto is smart, what he's going to do at debates and everywhere else is he's going to take these things one by one and demand that Abbott state, without qualification, do you support this or don't you? And Abbott will do one of two things: say yes, no, or hem and haw. And none of those three options is going to look good. I mean, Abbott has no good out in that situation. He'll just have to, come up with some pat answer. He'll probably have to duck the debates. I mean, that's really his best option there, or adopt a format that makes it very difficult for Beto to be able to do that, and just ignore the questions if they're not framed in a debate. But Beto should just make this whole platform and Abbott's responses or non-responses to them the whole thing. I mean, in the past it's fine, but this is a much closer election, one where a Democrat can actually win. I mean, this is just ammunition to the core. And given the other things that have happened, the jokes, the memes out there about how we've got these tractors that can work on Mars, but electricity not working on in Texas, which shows that scientists are running things on Mars and a Republican is running things in Texas. I mean, you've got and then everything else happening. He's got a lot to attack him on. This is just one more thing. And, it's Texas. So, the odds are still in Abbott's favor, but he did not need this.
So I don't know how true this is. I heard this last night that, people always talk about how California, if it was a country, would be the 6th or 5th largest economy in the world. People say that last night I heard Texas is the 9th largest, would be the 9th largest. So there's some degree of confidence that comes from having such a large population and a large amount of economic activity, home base for many in the oil and energy sectors. So they have a core constituency that really, I think, appreciates this. I want to mention that the Matt Rinaldi, who's the now current chair of the Texas GOP, his comment, he was asked basically like, how do you defend this? And his quote was, Republicans rightly have no faith in the 2020 election results, and we don't care how many times the elites tell us that we have to. We refuse to let Democrats rig the elections in 2022 or 2024. We can't compromise with Democrats who have a different and incompatible vision of our future. We need to be bold and unapologetic conservative party, ready to go on the offensive and win the fight for our country. This followed up by President Trump saying, look at the great state of former President Trump saying, look at the great state of Texas and their powerful Republican Party platform on the 2020 presidential election fraud. Such courage, but that's why Texas is Texas. And then Trump cheered to the statement, "We reject the results of the 2020 presidential election, and we hold that the acting president, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., was not legitimately elected." So the reason I mention all this in detail is because this is really what it's about. I mean, they are rallying the base.
Then they should not have attracted tech people there. If they wanted to maintain that club, they should not have attracted, tens of thousands of tech people there from the coasts. I mean, because that's what they're facing now, is a change of demographics. Now, maybe some of this stuff could be popular with the changing attitudes of some of the Latino people in the South. We did see that flip in that one Latino district, and maybe they can work on some of that, because maybe some of these positions aren't necessarily even if Latinos support it, maybe it's not a big deal to some of the Latino votes, some of these positions on homosexuality, particularly the social issues. Maybe not, but they're certainly not going to it's certainly not going to do them any favors in places like Austin, Houston, and Dallas. And it's going to get those voters out. And as has been happening in Georgia, passing those anti-voting measures has galvanized organization around them. People are getting to the votes anyways. They put up these roadblocks, but they are turning out because it is basically organized people. They're like, the fact that it's made it more difficult for them to vote has made them more willing to vote. So it set a record this last time. Okay, Supreme Court ruled in Maine. There was an issue with the in which private schools they allow for money, voucher money, to be spent on private schools. People are allowed to have a tax deduction for use of tuition in private schools. But the state of Maine was not allowing it to happen for religious schools on the basis of separation of church and state. That got challenged by parochial school interests, and it made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And on a strictly ideological partisan line, 6-3, the Supreme Court has held that you're discriminating against religious schools by allowing for the tuition subsidization for secular private schools and not for the religious schools. Sotomayor and the others are lamenting the complete breakdown of the wall of separation that Jefferson referred to. This is one more instance in which now we have basically government paying, public government tax dollars going to basically back religious indoctrination, if you will. I mean, because no limitations are put on these funds, and they can be used to teach religion. Of course, what happens when this happens, just as we've had rulings in the past giving, saying that it's cultural rather than religious to be able to post the Ten Commandments on public, courthouses. The Church of Satan has been allowed to put its statues and things onto public lands too, saying you can't discriminate against us. We are also a religion. Even when governments have tried to oppose it on the basis, well, they don't really believe in Satan. That's been held to be irrelevant. They're a religion. All that matters is that they qualify under the state and the rest. And so it'll be very interesting to see if anybody opens up a school, or Trotskyist school, Satan, whatever. That this is going to happen. But right now there is this ruling, and you have the Supreme Court. It's very interesting that we have so many Catholics on the Supreme Court, but very religious Catholics. Very interesting. Dynamics there. They're not even mainstream Catholics. They're from very interesting sects of the Catholic Church. and there is a very clear agenda. This is what's happening. We're about to see Roe overturned, and we are seeing now, however much they're strengthening the Second Amendment, the First Amendment, in terms of the separation of church and state, is being weakened. Dave?
So this one is really interesting, and I think you and I will end up talking about this again in the future. There's a string of 4 or 5 prior cases where they've been chipping away at the fundamental understanding of the separation of church and state, sort of contorting it into a justification for religious liberty, meaning not that they need to be separated, but that they need to be prevent the government from discriminating against the exercise of religion. So that's a broader issue here. But let's just talk about this case. So this was Carson versus Macon, and 6-3 ruling. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the opinion, and basically he's endorsing the claim that the Maine's government policies were hostile to religion, because the credits that were going to the public money that was going to go towards private school, a school was prevented from getting that money if it promoted a curriculum through the lens of their faith. So Roberts says that would exclude schools because they're practicing something they're free to practice, and that's discrimination. So he's saying the separation of church and state is discrimination, and we can talk more about that in the future. But the idea here is that these schools in Maine, in this particular area, rural, remote, all the private schools were most of them were religious, so there weren't a whole lot of options here. But this particular school had policies that were explicitly against gay and transgender students and staff, etc. So that's kind of why it flagged. But I want to point out what you said as being absolutely accurate. Justice Sotomayor, in her dissent, she said this makes the separation of church and state unconstitutional. And Justice Breyer said that the Constitution was actually designed to prevent rulings like this. So there's a really big schism on the court. Unfortunately, it's 6-3, and is nothing that can be done about it under our current political arrangement. But even the Maine Attorney General himself, before I throw it back to you here, the Maine Attorney General, Aaron Frey, his quote is, "It's disturbing that the Supreme Court found that parents also have the right to force the public to pay for an education fundamentally at odds with values we hold dear." He said that Maine's going to have to change their laws to find a way to ensure that, quote, ensure that public money is not used to promote discrimination, intolerance, and bigotry.
Honestly, I question whether public money should go to private schools anyway.
At this point.
That's I honestly, I just say keep it in the public schools. That's and that's just the lesson learned. Private schools are kind of I've got a problem with that to begin with. It tends to go to rich people anyways, or middle to upper middle class people at best. So maybe this is just a message. Yeah, stop it. Anything that resembles vouchers, then let's just shut that whole thing down and put an end to it. But that doesn't address the problem, because this is going to come up in other frameworks, and
right.
we got a problem here, because basically they have overturned the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. It means nothing now.
Right. And so not to interrupt you, but I just think it's important. I know we have only 2 minutes. I wanted to touch briefly on the case that I think was most recently relevant to this one, Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue. That was a 5-4 decision that required states with education tax credits to include religious schools. So basically, it's considered a school choice movement success. This is really an agenda for school choice, sort of within the confines of the argument about religious education. What happened in that case, which I think is really important, is that the Montana Supreme Court found that the program was unconstitutional because it said, I'm going to give state money to basically, it was a credit. If there was donations given to a private school fund kind of to help fund students' educations, the state was going to give a tax credit to match it, to sort of be a force multiplier to get kids into schools, to get into private schools. But in Montana, 70% of all private schools are religious. So in a way, it was a public program to endorse religious schools. So the Montana Supreme Court threw it out and said this is unconstitutional. But what Chief Justice Roberts' decision said, I'm overturning the Montana Supreme Court because that's the wrong remedy. The correct remedy is to reinstate the tax credit as it was designed and force the state of Montana to continue paying for religious schools, because we want to undo the harm. The harm was that religious schools were discriminated against. And so this there's a lot of implications to this, but the big one is that there are 38 state constitutions out there that support the separation of church and state. And instead of requiring this decision is requiring states to treat these schools equally in their funding policies, which is very different. And again, we'll pick this up later, but I think this is a really telling advancement. When Justice Breyer would say, "What are the limits of this court's holding? These are extreme consequences." The justices themselves, Justice Sotomayor said this was perverse and it throws the U.S. Constitution out of balance. So that's where we are.
We're going to have to come back to it again, but we have to go on to our next topic.
But if corporations were simply passing along these costs in highly competitive markets, would the company's profit margins have changed much?
So many things affect those that calculation. In principle, you could be right, but
well, it's very much not what we're seeing right now. Today, nearly 2 out of 3 of the biggest publicly traded corporations in the country are reporting fatter profit margins than they reported before the pandemic, which doesn't sound like they're just passing along costs. So let me ask you, does that increase in profit margins suggest to you that some corporations may be passing along increased costs?
Okay, final segment. Got a lot to try to talk about in this segment, but we're going to start with this is going to be about the economy. There's so much to talk about: inflation, gas prices, housing market, and we'll see what we can get done. But today, Powell from the Federal Reserve came and talked to Congress. He was in the hot seat, and he was discussing the recent increase in the rates, the loan rates to 0.75 of a point. It's not the first time he's raised the rates, but it's an attempt to try to tame inflation. And hopefully, it works. A lot of concern that this could also trigger a recession. Concern expressed by Elizabeth Warren, who's concerned that it might actually trigger a recession without actually containing inflation, also known as stagflation, which happened in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Devastating to working class when you don't have a job and the prices of everything are going up. Of course, gasoline is going through the roof and food are going through the roof, both exacerbated by the Russia-Ukraine war, and not much end in sight. The president is talking about a gas tax holiday. A lot of questions about whether or not that will even work. And the housing costs, prices are going through the roof, even as the market is collapsing. Dave, where do you want to go with this?
Yeah, so I think a good place to start is you mentioned the Federal Reserve's primary rate, the benchmark federal funds rate was raised recently an extraordinary 0.75 of a point, which was the highest since I think 1994. It's still extremely low, between 1.5 to 1.75 is the target range. But this is off of a decade of near zero. In part, that was because of the financial crisis of 2008, the housing market issue that we spoke about before. But of course, obviously, as they tried to normalize, we then hit the pandemic, and there was another wave of extraordinary rate reduction down to zero to try to stabilize the economy. So now with the inflation that comes from having a shuttered global economy reopen, there's pent up demand. People had accumulated some savings because of governmental assistance that was provided to sustain people during, try to keep people out of poverty, keep people fed, keep them in their homes. So there was this pent up demand that was released. People knew what it was like to sort of work from home or not work from home and sort of have the time to have a work-life balance in some way. So it was a disruption to the overall jobs market, where people were demanding better pay to meet the fact that there were over 2 open jobs for every out of work person. So it was kind of like a buyer's market, so to speak. It was a seller's market. You're selling your labor to your employer, and you could make demands, and they needed people back. There was upward pressure on pricing. In addition to that, there was upward pressure, labor pricing and commodities pricing, but also there was upward pressure on energy costs, because energy industry slowed down their production. They slowed down their refinement to account for the fact that nobody was driving anymore and that people weren't able to ship goods. So we've talked about this before. And so where are we now?
And not to mention the ports being blocked up because of outdated infrastructure, because Congress hasn't addressed that in decades.
Yep. Yeah. So President Biden was pushed to do something and say something. I think you and I talked about it 2 weeks ago. There was an op-ed piece he wrote, I think it was in Washington Post, where he said, that he laid out a couple things he's going to do, but the main thing he was going to do was continue to use the bully pulpit to have the Fed increase rates to cut off inflation to the best of their capacity, knowing their dual mandate was both full employment and 2% inflation. We found ourselves at closer to 8%. So there was a need, and the Fed at one point was going to raise interest rates a quarter point 6 times over the coming 6 sessions and kind of slow roll that out between now and the election, and even into 2023. But the Fed was getting a lot of pressure and hearing like, look, no, we have an overheated economy. There's something has to be done drastic. So they did this extraordinary increase. So that's kind of getting us to where we are. And the issue is that you mentioned Powell coming out and kind of giving the justification for being firm by raising rates and continuing to try to raise rates. But what I think made the headlines, or at least some of the headlines I read, was that President Biden went to former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers for guidance. And Larry Summers made a speech just Monday, kind of spilling the beans on what that conversation entailed. And what he said was that the country needs a lasting period of unemployment to rise to contain inflation, either a spike to 10% unemployment from our current level of 3 and change, or what I think that's what it is right now. I just pulled it up to get 3.6%. So he's saying we're going to need 10% unemployment, or 2 years of 7.5% unemployment, or 5 years of 6% unemployment. So no matter how you cut it, they want to double the number of people that don't have a job to slow down the amount of folks. That's a minimum. It could be up to 10%, which is a tripling, to slow down our ability to spend and bid up the pricing on things. And that'll start to simmer down inflation, and that would make it so that companies can't as easily raise prices. That when the demand comes down, companies will be forced to slow down the rate at which they're increasing prices on everything. So whether it's energy feeding into food, shipping costs, energy feeds into shipping costs. So just to try to cut this vicious cycle off as much as possible. But I think it's really important.
I just want to add, from my socialist upbringing perspective, that's psychotic. But let's just, we'll go on there to talk about increasing unemployment as an economic policy. But we'll go on.
I'm glad you spelled it out, because I just want to make it crystal clear. This is an article, Steve Goldstein from MarketWatch. He basically says Summers, in case you read the memo from what I said or what Eric just said, Summers is calling for unemployment to swell to roughly 16 million people from just under 6 million people last month. And so Jason Furman, who was a former chair of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, he's saying that, 25 years of history, there's this phenomena economists believe called the sacrifice ratio. And the sacrifice ratio is about 6 percentage points, which means 1 year of a 6 percentage point jump in unemployment or 2 years of a 3% jump in unemployment, which is an increase in the jobless rate, same thing, said differently, would be required to knock down inflation by 1 point.
Yeah, gotta love neoliberals.
So that's what's happening, and this is what President Biden has embraced. This is what the Federal Reserve has embraced. The Federal Reserve, again, just to be clear, the Federal Reserve is saying, well, we don't actually need it to be quite the way it sounds. So Christopher Waller, current Fed governor, said this isn't about the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. It's really about the trade-off, the difference between inflation and job openings. So if we were able to have less job openings, it would be a nicer way to frame the idea.
How about we just encourage the spending on services rather than goods? I mean, that's part of the problem, is that we went from a big jump from spending on services to goods, and a rush for it in the pandemic. If you spend it on service anyway, that's just it. But and there are ways that can be done. People have talked about it, but they don't.
So when they're looking at the labor line costs, if you were to do what you said, which is, okay, let's spend, instead of spending on things that cost money, let's spend them on a service. Well, it's still an expense from the perspective.
It is, but it's less inflationary.
And so what they're saying is real wages have increased at a rate which is incompatible with the mandate of 2% inflation. When just to be clear, there's, depending on which economist you're talking about, like I just watched a video from Milton Friedman the other day just to refresh my memory, where he just says inflation is money printing. Like he says straight up, it is only that. There are no other things that inflation is that. That is the cause. That's Milton Friedman direct from his own mouth. And so that's the Federal Reserve is never going to say that. Political leaders are never going to say that. Respectable economists, well, I say respectable, mainstream economists are never going to say that because that this is not how the world works. So Milton Friedman is now a anachronistic, except for just some extreme folks. But you and I wanted to pivot away from just the idea of a recession. Are we headed to a recession? 2/3 of economists polled say we're going to have a recession in 2023. But really, that just means that month over month, the growth in the GDP is negative.
It means 2 quarters of consecutive negative GDP.
The technical term with very little meaning.
It doesn't even necessarily mean a lot of people are suffering. It's a paper thing.
Right. And especially in light of the fact that we went from a shutdown where growth was extraordinarily robust coming out of that shutdown. When we throttle back to a sustainable level of growth, it could appear as slightly above zero, slightly below zero. It could really, that's a plateau of growth. But so a technical recession is not necessarily awful. What is feared from everyone is that the brakes are going to get put on the economy, and it's going to translate into other choices that are, like you said, where we have high costs, lots of unemployment, lots of pain, and that's not what people want.
That was the discussion, and this is why Elizabeth Warren was really indignant. She was actually really upset with the discussion. Why don't we talk a little bit about the gas tax holiday? Sure. There's some people who are saying that, well, if we have this gas tax holiday, the companies will just take it because it's the price is determined by what the market will bear, and the companies will just go ahead and take that money. Of course, to me, that will prove once and for all that the gas prices are not competitive, but instead it's basically price collusion, either by whether or not deliberate or by passively. But that's the claim, is that the companies won't actually lower the prices. They'll just grab that money. But in any case, it's probably going, if some Republican said it's dead on arrival in Congress, it's not going to happen. So this might be kind of a performative thing of Biden saying, well, I tried to do it, but the Republicans blocked it in Congress as part of a campaign thing. And so we'll never know whether it worked anyway. And Biden doesn't intend for it to work. He wants to be able to use it against the Republicans. Who knows?
I mean, I think it's really interesting that we pointed out that, that you pointed out that it was performative, because that's really what it comes down to. Is a lot of the talking heads are saying the president has to be seen as doing something. But when you look at a national average of about a $5 per gallon of gasoline, the federal gas tax is only 18 cents per gallon.
Yeah.
So it's around 4%. If you look at what the American Petroleum Institute says, they talk about in a gallon of gasoline, about 60% is the cost of crude, 14, and there's different charts at different times, but 14% is the refining, 11% is distribution, 14% is taxes. So depending on who you look at, the idea though is that your taxes are really just going to be marginally different. It is somewhat performative.
Yeah, but for political points, Biden proposes gas tax holiday, Republicans obstruct, might be good for, a few votes here and there for the campaign. I think that's what it's about. All right, this brings us to predictions. Dave, what do you got?
I know we've talked about it before, but I think it's important to mention again in light of the January 6 hearings. Republican Representative Liz Cheney has been getting accolades from some corners for her participation and being an outspoken critic of President Trump's actions leading up to January 6th. She was even given the prestigious John F. Kennedy Profiles in Courage Award. There's talk of making a nonpartisan attempt to try to persuade Democrats and independents to vote for her, to support her in the August 16th GOP primary against Trump-backed candidate Harriet Hageman. But in her corner of the country, Wyoming, with only one seat in the House, this is wildly unpopular. And I want to briefly say this. Wyoming Secretary of State's most recent numbers. There are 200,000 registered Republicans, only 45,000 registered Democrats in a state of 579,000 people and 281,000 registered voters. There are 6 times more Republicans. And so Cheney won her last election by over 40 points. Now she's down by over 30 points. So it looks right now that, even though she voted with Trump 93% of the time, according to 538, the fact that she voted for Trump's impeachment, her participation on the January 6th committee, it's too much for the Wyoming GOP to tolerate in the era of Trump. Her campaign, Hageman's campaign ad sums it up pretty nicely. It says Cheney's not riding for the brand. And what that means, according to Deseret News from Utah, is that, quote, it's a not so subtle callback to the code of the West, when cowboys were expected to do the bidding of the rancher who hired them. And some recent NBC headline says Cheney's January 6th committee spotlight burns her in Wyoming primary. I think she's going to be burned.
All right. I'm going to be very quick. This pertains to Eastman. I think that Trump is going to turn on him, throw him under the bus. And if Merrick Garland ever wakes up, he'll probably will be charged. But I think at the minimum, he's going to be disbarred. But people are already turning on him. Stephen Groves, who was a spokesman for Trump's White House, says anytime you give legal advice and then feel compelled to ask for a pardon, it probably wasn't good legal advice. They're already kind of distancing from him. Trump is already saying, Eastman who? It's already like, oh, we weren't really close. It's already looking like that. Eastman's sort of the focus right now. I would not want to be Eastman right now, and I think it's the writing's on the wall there, and we'll see if it comes true. In the meantime, until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.